the term friend as in, like a good acquaintance, like, people that you hang out with or that you communicate with. I mean, I dare say, the definition that you would have of friend is that, someone who you actually do truly value in your life.
Well, I guess my point about it would be, I think we lose less friends than, I think it's less that, let me say, I think it's less that we lose friends more than we discover that perhaps they weren't really our friends in the first place. That's I think the major point, honestly, because in many cases, especially, I mean, you see it also in love relationships. That you get you get into these relationships with people because you don't want to be alone, or you're attracted to them, or whatever. I've been working on a blog about that forever, but you're attracted to them, or you don't want to be alone, or both, or you're lonely, so you start making excuses so that you can accept somebody into your life who will help you deal with that loneliness, and you end up with people that are not exactly who you thought. But while you're caught up in the when you're caught up in the rapture of it, you don't think about that. Yeah, and I think the same thing is true of friendships.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a deliberate delusion that we put ourselves in. I mean, you're mentioning about you've pertained to this sort of the skewed motivations, like the misplaced motivations that we have for getting into our some of our relationships. It reminds me of there's actually a specific podcast that Stefan Molyneux has done about that. It's called How to Meet a Nice Girl. Mm-hmm. And it's a very, very insightful podcast where he basically says that that like minds attract like minds. That if you're a highly neurotic personality, then you're going to attract a person who will enhance those qualities. So if you want to find a nice girl, then you need to find ways to enhance the niceness within yourself, and start doing things where that actually do enhance those qualities in you. And also, you're not going to find a wife in a nightclub where people are just wanting to, find someone to get laid.
For sure.
If you're actually looking for a wife, then and you have certain interests, the best place to find her is to actually, engage in social situations where you will find someone who is of that like mind and will gravitate towards that sort of thing as well, but yeah, I mean, I completely understand your point that it's more about, finding out that people are of a different persuasion, dare I say. I mean, there's one thing that you might be able to empathize with, maybe not in this exact phrasing, but probably something very similar to it, where I used to do this myself with a lot of conversations where, I don't know, say for example, like a group of maybe 3 to 5 individuals are all hanging out and they're talking about how bad things are getting, and then almost as if by clockwork, the conversation gets brought down to a close by someone saying, well, what can you do? And everyone sort of like silently nods and agrees.
Right.
I cannot stand it when someone says that. I have to start biting my tongue. I really do.
Well, people do that about so many things. We're kind of conditioned to do that, and people who are inclined to say, no, let's not just settle it at that. Those are the people who, you can get in trouble for that socially if you do that. People don't like that. They like being able to just pretend everything's okay. That's actually one of the funny things about, I said everything is okay. That might ring some bells if you think about it, but Danny Shine and Charlie Veitch, used to just all Danny was doing was holding up a sign that said everything is okay, and he got harassed by the police.
Hmm.
because it was evident that, he was making a statement.
How
So
ironic.
what kind of statement are you making when, you say everything's okay? Especially when it's obviously not. And that was the reason he did it.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
and that's, I think, one of the, it's just, like I said, even in like really small things, like, I often talk about this because it's part of kind of like what I'm researching right now as far as human behavior is this tendency to, I don't know if you ever heard the term, don't cause drama, like
Oh,
it's,
yeah.
it's the
Oh,
way to
great.
get it socially in trouble for daring to point out when something is messed up. The example I usually give is, say you're at a family gathering. This is always a real problem when you're in family situations, but you know, uh, there's always some obnoxious member of a large family if they still have gatherings, and they show up to these gatherings and it is expected that you will just let this obnoxious person make everyone uncomfortable and, ruin the evening for everyone because that's better than you standing up and asking them to stop and then that resulting in a conflict,
Yeah.
and ruining the evening for everyone. you
Yeah, I
know,
mean,
um,
it's in no way acceptable for that person to cause the disruption, but it's just as unacceptable to try and, at least try and curb their behavior in the situation. You can do it retrospectively, but you can't do it in the moment. That's just as unacceptable as the initial disruption, which is completely insane.
right. And that's, overall, people have kind of just conditioned themselves to the idea that they should just pretend everything's okay, and then that will allow them to just kind of not face the truth. They'd rather just, it's like everybody says, oh, it's a downer, like to talk about those kinds of things. And as a result, we're all just kind of blissfully walking through life. It's, I guess it reminds me of like, a group of birds burying their heads in the sand because that's better than facing the truth.
Yeah.
Only it's worse because not only, I mean, they're not burying their heads in the sand, they're just gonna, continue to play their violin while Rome burns.
Yeah, because it's because the people who actually engage in that sort of that willful apathy don't recognise that the very execution of that apathy actually perpetuates and exacerbates the problem itself. It's like the old Albert Einstein quote. I'll probably butcher the paraphrasing of it, but the world is not a dangerous place because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the willful ignorance of those who see that there is problems, but choose to do nothing about it. I mean, I can understand to a certain degree that the problems in our world seem to be so insurmountable that there must be nothing that can be done. But that's mainly because they haven't been exposed to the tools of critical thinking, to the solutions that can be sought. And one of the things that I'm very diligent about, especially with talk, hanging around other activists, is especially if they're in TZM, is that that the solutions proposed by the Zeitgeist movement is not the only solution. It's one of the solutions, but it's not it's not the only solution. And the very fact that there are multiple solutions to the problem, it gives less and less and less and less and less of an excuse to look the other way. But the reason why people look the other way is because it's much easier to do that. So, is it is it due to that taking the easy route that makes things so difficult, or is it purely because we've been conditioned to find that easier? I mean, I would find it now that I've actually been exposed to a train of thought that actually gives me so much more hope and optimism. It would be, I can't imagine going back to sleep. Could you?
No, in fact, that's actually something I wrote in one of my recent blogs. When people were asking me where I was, I thought I would just write a blog about it, and just to kind of get it all out of the way. And one of the things that was difficult about, it actually, in some ways, I can almost understand why some of these people prefer. It reminds me of the situation in The Matrix when they're talking about the pills. Which pill are you going to take? And then the character Cypher just couldn't handle reality, so he literally just would rather go sit in a tank and be a battery that's experiencing a delusion than he would, actually, deal with real life.
Mm.
And I think that's, it's important, on the other hand, that to take time to yourself for things that entertain you. That's fine.
Oh, yeah.
It's a question of, is that all you do? Is that the extent of, your life? Like, one of the reasons why it's harder for me to do activist-oriented stuff as often as I usually do if I'm working a full-time job is because you get home and you're like, man, I really need to unwind and, just sit down, maybe watch a TV show or something. It's hard to maintain that. And I honestly think that's part of what's wrong with the system. I think the system is actually designed that way to keep you from ever really thinking too much. But that aside, it is still important to take some time to yourself. Even as an activist, if you don't take time to yourself, you're not going to be effective in anything you do, whether it's your work, your relationships, your friendships, your parenting. If you don't have some time to yourself, everything else suffers. It actually kind of reminds me of the video game The Sims. I don't know if you ever played The Sims.
Yeah.
I haven't played any of the newer versions of it, but one of the things that your sim needs is fun. And if you don't have it, your sim starts screwing up and everything else, Yeah. So, but overall, though, I think that we as a society have just kind of, it's like our natural inclination to try to find the most peaceful, blissful, conversation where we can all just be talking about positive things and never bring up anything negative. Because that way, and I honestly think some of it I think is about brain chemistry. Like, I talked to Stefan Molyneux about this once when I called into one of his shows. But, we have dopamine. Dopamine is like the brain's natural feel-good drug that it uses to, to kind of entice you to do things that are generally good for one's survival. You get dopamine rushes when you're procreating. You get dopamine rushes when, you're in love. You get dopamine rushes when someone loves you. If you're being publicly adored or, whatever, like, it's your birthday, you get dopamine rushes. If you're being, approved of by a group of people, you get dopamine rushes. And when you're in any situation that could threaten your normal dopamine rushes, then there's other chemicals that get released that make you afraid.
Yeah.
And that's how, we end up in so many dumb situations, because just because you happen to be feeling good at the moment does not necessarily mean that your life is actually good. It doesn't actually mean necessarily that the situation you're in is actually good. It just means that you've done a pretty good job of convincing yourself that it is. All species on this planet have some form of, inner chemistry, wiring, so to speak, to try to achieve, survival situations. Humans, on the other hand, have more complications in that, first of all, we tend to forget that we are subject to these same things just like every other organism on the planet. And worse than that, we're capable of deluding ourselves in certain ways to get these kinds of rushes, these dopamine rushes, even if the situation doesn't really call for it, even if the situation, in fact, might even not even be that good. Well, it's better that I keep my dopamine sources of being good with this particular crowd than it would be for me to stand up and say, I tend to not appreciate the thing that X alpha personality in the group is